Tedimer, this is the end of an era in American politics and American history. Senator Edward Kennedy has lost his battle to brain cancer at the age of 77. The youngest of the Kennedy brothers, he spent nearly 50 years as a U.S. Senator, a champion of the working class and the poor, a powerful voice on health care, civil rights, and war and peace. 22 News reporter Jacqueline Cashman takes a look back at the life and legacy of Senator Edward Kennedy.
Senator Edward Kennedy was the surviving patriarch of Massachusetts' most famous political family and the last tie to Camelot.
I personally believe that the people of this country would rather do with a little less gasoline in their gas tanks rather than spilling the blood of young Americans to guard the old PEC gas lines in the Middle East.
From his early days to present, Senator Kennedy's oratorical power will always ring deep in the hearts and minds of Massachusetts residents. But the state's senior senator hoped his legacy will be helping to bring about universal health care.
And guarantee that every American, north, south, east, west, young, old, will have decent, quality health care as a fundamental right and not a privilege.
Ted Kennedy served 9 terms in the Senate. He launched his political career in 1962 when his brother, John F. Kennedy, vacated his Senate seat to become our president. Years later, Teddy even tried following in his brother's footsteps, making a campaign stop right here in Springfield.
Any of you that have relatives up there in the state of New Hampshire, even if they're cousins and distant cousins, you get out there on the phone and you make sure you give them a call and make sure they do the right thing tomorrow for good old Kennedy.
Many thought Senator Kennedy's presidential ambitions were stifled by the 1969 Chappaquiddick incident. The public doubted Kennedy's account of the car accident where he drove his vehicle off a bridge, resulting in the death of passenger Mary Jo Kopechne. During his presidential career spanning 5 decades in Washington, the third longest-serving senator of all time wrote more than 300 bills enacted into law. The elder statesman of the Democratic Party, Kennedy chaired the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. The 77-year-old was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor after suffering a seizure at his home in Hyannisport in May of 2008. Despite a grim prognosis, he made the trek to Denver for the Democratic National Convention to support presidential candidate Barack Obama.
Nothing is going to keep me away from this special gathering tonight.
Kennedy spent his final months sailing his boat Maya and enjoying family time on Cape Cod, something his son, Rhode Island Congressman Patrick Kennedy, called a gift, affording them special time they wouldn't have had.
As I look ahead, I am strengthened by family and friendship.
Ted Kennedy leaves his wife, Vicki, children Patrick, Kara, and Edward Jr. For 22 News, I'm Jacqueline Cashman.
And joining us in studio this morning is Springfield political consultant Tony Cignoli. Tony, thanks for waking up early and joining us this morning. First off, just your thoughts on the passing of this legend in the Senate, and not only for Massachusetts politics, but for national politics as well.
Well, certainly today, and as the day goes on, not just across the United States, but literally around the globe, people will be focused on this. This is gigantic. It's the end of an era, as you said. It's the end of what was left of Camelot. And even more so, it's one of the grandest lions of the United States Senate. Whether folks liked him or disliked him, whether Republican thought or Democratic thought, this was one of the greatest members of the United States Senate. And even Republicans would say that at this point, like Orrin Hatch. This is a gigantic passing. You know, it would not be surprising to me if, though the Kennedy family, I think, wants to keep this as close to home as possible in Hyannis, I would not be surprised if Ted Kennedy laid in state, you know, in the rotunda in the Capitol, as very few other senators have. It's a gigantic impact. This was an international senator. This was someone that could bring the bacon back to Massachusetts or help a Republican friend like Arlen Specter bring it back home to Pennsylvania. It's huge.
And, you know, ironically, it happens right during this health care debate and the reform debate that we've been talking about. And health care was so important to him. And it's possible that without his voice, it hasn't happened yet. Is that, am I right in that? We haven't had him out there on the stump to talk about health care reform, and so far it hasn't happened.
Very intriguing. There's a lot of thought along those lines. A lot of the insiders within the Beltway in Washington, members of Congress in the House and the Senate, and again, Republicans and Democrats opining exactly to what you just said. You know, and just in the last 4 or 5 days, there's a lot of national stories about the fact that without Ted Kennedy in Washington, you know, despite the fact that he was pushing from home or had a very capable staff and surrogates, other senators out there fighting, it wasn't the same as Kennedy himself being able to go out there and put the arm on different folks, or to use the charm or the charisma, or remind folks of votes passed where he had helped them. You know, there's no one that was able to fill that exact role. And it is ironic, and even more so ironic, that the President of the United States happens to be at Martha's Vineyard when this passing occurs.
Yeah, actually, we have not heard an official White House statement yet from President Obama. I'm sure that will be coming shortly. This news came very early in the morning. What is his greatest legacy, Ted Kennedy?
Oh, gosh, there's so many different things. From his early on in his career, fighting on the civil rights piece, the big civil rights vote in 1964. He had been in the Senate for a short amount of time, but it was one of the votes where he was able to make his voice well heard and carry on some legacy of his brother, the president. The civil rights piece, gigantic. Health care, over and over again. The national public service piece, one of his most recent accomplishments in the Senate. You know, in fact, Ted Kennedy, arguably, is probably one of the members of the United States Senate in the entire history of the Senate who has filed or authored more bills and more legislation than almost any other member of the Senate. And you could go way back on that to folks like Daniel Webster even. That is one of the legacies of Ted Kennedy. He's one of the great record breakers and record makers, you know, in the United States Senate for having authored all kinds of legislation.
Okay, Tony Cignoli, the political consultant from Springfield, thanks for joining us. And Tony will be back again coming up during the next 2 hours to talk about the life and legacy of Senator Ted Kennedy. And I mentioned that President Obama has not made a statement. Well, he actually has just made a statement. The president says that the United States has lost the greatest United States senator of our time with the death of Ted Kennedy. Obama called Kennedy a great leader and praised his work to advance civil rights, health, and economic well-being of all Americans. He also thanked Kennedy for his wise counsel in the Senate, as well as his support for last year's presidential race. Kennedy's endorsement in the 2008 Democratic primary was seen as a huge boost to the Obama campaign. Obama added that as president, he benefited from Kennedy's encouragement and wisdom, even as the senator battled brain cancer. And of course, Senator Kennedy also had political aspirations. 22 News reporter Jacqueline Cashman, actually presidential aspirations. And he followed his 1980 presidential challenge to then-President Jimmy Carter.
The exhibition hall at the Springfield Civic Center overflowed tonight as people paid $10 apiece to hear Kennedy speak.
1980, Democratic presidential candidate Edward Kennedy campaigning in Springfield, hoping Western Massachusetts residents could help get out the vote.
Any of you that have relatives up there in the state of New Hampshire, even if they're cousins and distant cousins, you get out there on the phone and you make sure you give them a call and make sure they do the right thing tomorrow for good old Kennedy.
Speaking one-on-one with 22 News, he knew the challenges ahead, yet remained optimistic.
I like to try and think of campaign as the American hockey team. They were underdogs right up to the time of the big match. We have an uphill battle up in New Hampshire.
Kennedy lost the Granite State primary the next day to incumbent Jimmy Carter. 22 News traveled to New York's Madison Square Garden, which hosted the Democratic National Convention that year.
Get your dartboards! Carter, Kennedy, Reagan, and Bush! Get your dartboards!
How hopeful are you tonight?
We're very hopeful. You know, anything can happen tonight. I just hope that, as I said to our Massachusetts delegation, that everybody keep their hearts and their minds open.
Kennedy didn't get the delegate votes he needed, but as history would later prove, Senator Kennedy certainly became the lion of the Senate. For 22 News, I'm Jacqueline Cashman.